afterwards, we're going to, thank you, Owen. Afterwards, we're going to have 3 breakout rooms where if you want to ask questions about a constitutional amendment, directive mandate, or ISSU policy, and don't worry if these words are confusing, we shall be explaining them all. And we're going to have those individual clinics where you can go speak with officers who have a large amount of experience in this area, and you can ask them specific questions and use them. I want to abolish the and basically, how do I do that? What's the best way to put that in a constitutional amendment? Am I breaking up, or is everything coming through okay, Owen?
It was for a sec, but I think it's back.
Yeah, I just got something saying, but if that ever happens again, just let me know.
Yeah.
You didn't miss anything?
I think I got the gist, but if you want to like rewind like 15 seconds and just say it.
Just to say, basically at the end, we're going to be having individual clinics. We're just going to have 3 rooms for the 3 different types of policies where you can go in, speak with these officers, and get the most information. Before we get started with the actual presentation, at any point, please throw a question in the chat and we'll address them at the end. Just throw it in at any point, don't stress, and we'll just have the list and we'll go and run through them. And yes, please stick around. The most important thing here, we want you, no matter what your policy is, we don't care what it is, we just want to make sure it's put together in a structurally sound way. We're just here to make sure you have all the information for it to enact what you want it to. So without further ado, we're just going to hop straight in. Owen, I'm just going to ask you to confirm that you can see everything right now.
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, I'll just run up. Okay, I'll just start my recording as well. Perfect. All right, so let's get started. Welcome to Bhliaintiúl Policy Writing Workshop for the ISSU Annual Assembly, proudly sponsored by StudyClick's Maths Tutor and the like. So first off, this is the most important thing. This presentation is not a binding list of rules or regulations that constitutional amendments, directive mandates, or ISSU policy proposals need to adhere to. That's not what this is. This is purely advice. You can take it, you can leave it. This is just coming from 3 years of experience within ISSU and just the things we've learned and the challenges that have come from poorly written policies in the past. Now, introduction. I'm going to assume that those of you here have 0 information on what is actually what the actual debates are. So basically, at Annual Assembly, we do 4 things. We elect our Cuiste Gnó, and then we debate policy. We debate motions. There are 3 kinds of motions. There is the ISSU policy, the directive mandate, and the constitutional amendments. Obviously, our constitutional amendments amend our constitution. Our directive mandates give specific actions, projects, and tasks that we want the executive to complete over their term when they are elected. And ISSU policy is our policy book. We'll be explaining each of these in depth in this presentation. Most important thing you need to know is that you are able to propose any of these. You can propose to add an ISSU policy and then it's debated on and it's either passed or not. You can propose a directive mandate and it's debated or passed or not. And it's the same with constitutional amendments. And that makes up what our Annual Assembly or Cobalt Bhliaintiúl actually is. The most important thing you need to know is that the policies and mandates, they only need 50% plus 1 of all delegates to pass. And then the constitutional amendments requires 2/3 majority to pass. That's the main thing. The actual timeline to actually have these submitted is Friday, the 8th of April. That's very important because you need to get it in then. But once it's actually in, there will be about a 7-day period where you can amend it and where also anyone else can propose an amendment, which would actually be debated on the day of. So for example, I put forward a constitutional amendment to change the ISSU logo to bright neon green. I wouldn't recommend it. But someone can say over that 7-day period to make an amendment, I'm going to actually change it to, I would like to amend this so that's actually a lime green rather than a neon green, and that will be debated as well. So that gives you a kind of idea. Before I actually hop into, as you see, we're going to start explaining each one, breaking it down very easily and comprehensively to give you all the information you need. Does anyone have any very fundamental questions about annual assembly and just very basic about issue, because I feel like if there's any of those very fundamental questions, answering that now I think would be of great help to you. Feel free to throw it in the chat as well, but I'm going to take that as a no. Going, gone. Perfect. Okie dokie. Well, next. So constitutional amendments. As you can see here, a constitutional amendment represents fundamental changes and almost legally binding rules that can only ever be changed by an annual assembly. That's our annual assembly, our Chomhdháil Bhliaintiúl. That is the only place that has the power to make amendments to our constitution. It's like the laws of the ISSU. It can be as simple as changing a name of an officership, of a body, or even the name of the Irish Second Level Students' Union. You can create an entirely new branch of the organization. You can say, hold on, there's something else we're missing here. We should create a Senate of the ISSU where we have different subjects all represented, and create this entirely new structure. Or dissolve every single officership that we have and completely dissolve our structure and remake it in your own image. And that can all be done in a single constitutional amendment. You have the power to propose that. So it can be as wide-ranging or as specific as you want. To give you an actual, as you can see, we have it linked in the, and you can find the Constitution on our website. This is our beautiful Constitution. It's 31 pages long, and this is our fundamental governing document that gives all of our, it decides how our elections work, how our annual assembly runs, the aims and objectives, who our members actually are. It is the most fundamental, most important document in the whole union. And this is the only time we ever get to change it, is once a year. And that is your place to do that. Okay, so we'll go back here. So the most important thing is that constitutional amendments, they need 66% of delegates to vote in favor for them to pass. So the most important thing when you're writing your constitutional amendment is it needs to have broad appeal. If it doesn't have broad appeal, it's not ever going to get there. And so that's really important. The second most important thing is where, you know, unintended consequences. And there's such an example that we go into here, but when you make a constitutional amendment, you need to be really considered. You need to decide, you know, what is it we actually want to change, and you don't want it to affect something that you don't mean it to. So, for example, there was once a constitutional amendment that said no candidate may contest an ISSU election if they're no longer a second level student. What they meant is for the Cuiste, which is our executive, but that meant that no one was ever going to be able to run for our monitoring committee. And our monitoring committee is a structure that's made up of past ISSU officers, and it's all older people who are out of secondary school. And so that meant we would have had no monitoring committee. And so while a lot of people may have agreed with the constitutional amendment, they voted against it because it meant we wouldn't have had any monitoring committee. And that's where you need to be really considered in making sure you don't leave anything out. The next part is location. You have to choose where you're going to actually make your amendment very carefully. What we mean by that is if it's in the wrong place, it's not going to be seen. And that's where I'm going to just give you a quick breeze through the Constitution. So, and also here's an important part, that sometimes a constitutional amendment, it might affect 2 or 3 articles in the Constitution. And so, you know, it's important to, you know, make those changes throughout it. So, for example, Article 10 deals with the roles of individual Cuiste officers. So don't put changing something into Article 4, which is about the fundamentals of the organization. And, you know, you want to actually be very specific in realizing where you need to put it. And for that, we're going to give you a quick rundown of the Constitution. If you have not read this, I wouldn't be submitting a constitutional amendment without reading this a little bit. As you can see, we have 16 articles. The first article is the title of the organization. So as you can see, it just runs through what the actual organization is. Next, we have the fundamentals. This lays down the fundamentals of us as an organization, what we are, our definition, the main objectives that we have, our mission statement, what we aim to do in being a catalyst for change in education, and then our core specs, as you can see here. Next, we have our aims and objectives, which is a little more specific in that, you know, we're transparent, reliable, protective. And this is just what we fundamentally, in everything we do, what needs to be our guiding principles. and how we will achieve these aims. Next is our legal governance. This just talks about the board of directors, which is above the executive and is responsible for the legal and financial liability of the organization. Next, we go into membership, and everything here is completely open to amendment by any of you. And so it describes, here as a student council, these are our members. Members are open to all democratic student councils. This is how they have to actually join. They have to vote themselves. And then this is granting non-member schools observer status so they can come and see different things. Then there's Article 6, our operational structure, which lays out all the different actual bodies. So we have the board of directors, the Quishkino, working groups, monitoring advisory committee, regional officer body. It just lays it all down there. Next, we have Article 7, which is about annual assembly or on Cobalt Bhliaintiúl. If you want to change anything about how our annual assembly works, this is the place to put it in. And it gives everything about how much notice we have to give, how it works, and what is actually done at those events. It also talks about an emergency assembly, so the rights to actually do that. We have it that members can call an emergency assembly themselves, and if you want to change the rights around that, that's fully up to you. Article 8, we then talk about the Monitoring and Advisory Committee, and they're sort of, I call them the judiciary, and they just give us a rundown of, how that actually works, and they make sure that the Constitution is upheld. And we've changed this, we've added so that there's 5 members, we've added so that they have to do more, and again, this is all open to you to do. Next, we go into Article 9, and that's the Quishtigano, or the National Students Executive. And that's the executive made up of the president and the 12 other officers. This is about them collectively, what their responsibilities are as a body together. And they are the public representatives, and they cannot vote as members in any regional council. That the chairperson is the Uachtaráin, that this is when they have to hold meetings. And then we have the expectations, rights, and responsibility of the Quishtigano. So this is basically, as a group, what they have to uphold and what they have to do. And so these are all things that maybe you should look at and decide what you need to do. This is our no confidence procedure and how that works. And that's an example constitutional amendment we'll be highlighting later on. But that's, again, one other part. Then this is the Quishtigano's relationship with the regional officer body, which is important. Article 10 then discusses the actual roles of the individual officers. So this is where you can get a detailed look about what each of them have to do, the definition of their role, and the scope. So if you want to add a new officership, or if you want to change how a specific officer works or reinvent an officer, this is the place to do it in Article 10. Moving on from Article 10, we have the regional officer body. So this is our regional structure, your regional officers, your local representatives. And then this lays out all of their responsibilities and how the regional council works, and then how the regional, their relationship with the ISSU school reps work. Maybe I'm of the opinion we should split so that school reps have their own one, and that we should maybe rejig a few things. But if you want to change something about the regional structure and about the connection between regional officers and their schools, it's Article 11 is where you want to go. Moving on to the next part, Article 12, that's the Secretariat. So this is our staff members, and this gives them the standing in our organization. Then the senior leadership team, that's made up of the presidents as well as the secretariat, and that's just very small. But if you want to make a change to that, that's where it goes. This is ISSU directive mandates and ISSU policy book. So this is the actual directive mandates we talk about and the policy book, which we'll also be discussing. This explains how they work and how you can amend those. So as you can see, this just goes through it and how they're amended. As you can see, amended by directive mandates can only be set by Cobalt Bhliaintiúl or annual assembly. So that gives you. Article 15 is how our elections work. So if you want to change anything about how our elections happen, Article 15 is the place to do it. And finally, Article 16 is constitutional amendments. So I might actually run through this one because it's small. It gives you an idea of how the Constitution is structured, but also it just gives you the proper idea. It gives you a definition as well. This document shall surpass all previous versions of the ISSU Constitution, i.e. the 2015 Constitution is nothing because this one is the newest one and the most up-to-date. A constitutional amendment is defined as any alteration to the exact words contained in this existing document, any addition of words, paragraphs, articles, or appendix, and any removal of any words. Constitutional amendments can only be passed by 2/3 plus 1 majority. All member schools may submit constitutional amendments to An Cobalt Bhliaintiúl. All members of the Quishtigano may submit constitutional amendments. The Quishtigano shall set deadlines for submissions of these amendments while allowing an appropriate time for member schools to discuss the motion thoroughly. Every amendment will be proposed by a voting delegate from a proposing member school or a member of the Cuishgano or ROB. All members of the ROB may submit constitutional amendments. So that's our rundown. You know what the Constitution is and you know the things. The most important thing is all of those articles, you can invent a new article. You can invent an entirely new aspect to the organization. And that's important for you to know too. We then have our appendixes, and the appendix is something separate, which we will, but it's about where you note something up, but it needs a lot more information, and it belongs in the Constitution. So the perfect example is our working group. So working groups, we mention them and then see the working group policy in Appendix 2. And then second to that, Appendix 3, co-ops and by-elections, how they work. So if you want to change how a co-option works, that's Appendix 3. And finally, no confidence procedure. So that's the removal of an officer from the executive. And so that's really important. So it needs to be in the Constitution, but shouldn't have its own article. So we put it in as an appendix. Now, when you're actually writing your amendment, what does it need to look like? So we have that it needs to appeal. We have that you need to make sure that there's not unintended consequences. So you need to really, really consider. We also have gone over that you need to be careful of the location. Well, the final thing is that it's not too prescriptive. If a constitutional amendment is, oh, my apologies. If a constitutional amendment is too restrictive and inflexible, it can cause problems. For example, there was one constitutional amendment and it introduced mandatory trainings, which was great, but it had specific dates that the trainings had to be completed on. And this meant that there was no, if a date didn't work for anyone, we couldn't move it because that's what the Constitution said. And so you can't be too prescriptive. The Constitution is a place for much more fundamental things, and it should be flexible in order to avoid problems. Not flexible in the sense of an out, but flexible in giving a certain amount of discretion to the officers. So you have to have a mandatory training, and it should be before September. So it gives maybe a 6-month period for them to actually hold the training. Now, what does a constitution? There'll be a form that you will fill in, which will give you a lot of space to do that. But this is an example of an amendment that I put in last year. It was the amendment to, doesn't actually have the title here, but it was an amendment to add a no confidence procedure to the Constitution. So we have the constitutional amendment to add the below article as Article 9.9 and change the current Article 9.9 to 9.10. So that just meant we're just going to add this in here in Article 9, which is about the Cuishgano and how they work collectively. And we just said add the below text. So we weren't changing anything. We were just literally opening it and slotting it in. An officer may only be removed from their position through a vote of no confidence in the event that the officer in question is found to be seriously and repeatedly failing to act in accordance with the standard expected of an elected ISSU officer. We don't just leave it there. We then say such failures include and list them. This is important in that it gives a very clear definition of the scope of what this article is dealing with. So breach of the ISSU Constitution, a code of conduct or child protection policy, a breach of a confidentiality agreement, gross misconduct, bullying or discrimination, failing to fulfill their duties as an NSE officer, bringing the reputation of the ISSU into dispute, and any other instance where the monitoring committee deems that the actions of the officer is such that grossly breaches the Constitution or values of the ethos of the ISSU, that it breaks, and then you'll see I have this highlighted, the bond of trust that must exist between officers and the organization. To such an extent, it effectively ends the relationship and warrants removal. What this is important of is this is evidence of research that is taken from the definition of gross misconduct, where instant dismissal is allowed in a workplace. It's very different, but it just shows you need to be very considered and strategic in what you're putting out there. And then the next important part here is that we then reference a vote of no confidence must be completed in strict adherence to Appendix 4 entitled No Confidence Procedure. So as you see, we've realized that the appendix needs to be there. We need to go into more detail. So we've created the appendix and noted it there. So when people are reading it, they know where to look. This is also very clear for anyone reading. They know where it's going to be. As you can see by the 9.9, they know where, so they can find in the Constitution. There should have been the title here, which said Amendment to the Constitution on inserting a motion of no confidence. So they know what it's about. And it's very, goes through everything here, being specific, but not prescriptive, in that it gives a lot of space where, there's no real loopholes. so to speak. And I would just highlight, it needs to be extremely well thought out, considered. Otherwise, it will be noticed and it will fail. There were some great constitutional amendments that had those unintended consequences. That meant that a great amendment had to be thrown out, not thrown out, but people voted it down, even if they agreed with it, because it created a problem that just couldn't be fixed. You can then see here that constitutional amendments, the ISSU constitution is here. And we should have some examples of amendments from last year that I'm sure we'll be able to forward on to you. Next, first off, I'm going to ask if anyone has any questions about constitutional amendments. There will be plenty of time to ask more questions, but I'll give anyone the opportunity to come in here with any clarifications they want immediately. Oh, and is there anyone with their hand up?
Not currently, but if you do have one, you can candidate propose an amendment. If you're a delegate, yeah, but candidates should be delegates, so yes.
Yeah, so that's a great question. Also, please just throw questions into the chat. I promise I don't bite much.
But I would just make this distinction. If a candidate is proposing an amendment, you are proposing it as a delegate, and you do not make in any way reference your candidacy. It is about you being a delegate. A candidate will be a delegate already, so put it in that capacity. It's not. The elections are for a separate day, so keep that completely separate from it, but you are well within your rights to propose one.
We'll just, yeah, that's covered later in the presentation as well. But yeah, a candidate, as long as you are a delegate from a school, which in order to register, you would have had to get the vote from, you would have had to go through your student council, so you will be registered. So as long as you're a delegate, you can propose it. If you're a regional officer or a member of the executive, you can also propose them in those capacities. Please feel free to throw any questions into the chat. Moving on, we're then going to go to our directive mandates. So a directive mandate directs the Coisceiceach to undertake a specific action or aim as a priority for the year. It is an active workload for them to do. It's a job to be done. A direct input by the membership into the executive's work plan. The mandates should not apply to specific officers, but instead to the entire executive. Therefore, it is all of our responsibilities to ensure that they are done. What we mean by that is, and I'll just pull up our directive mandates book now. And you're not able to see this bar here. That's my mouse is over at the minute. Can you?
No, like a taskbar, no.
No, perfect. So that's just the Zoom itself, directive policy book. So this is our old directive policy book. So this is just to give you an idea of what directive policies look like, where there's a difference now. There's a difference between policies and mandates. We're talking about mandates at the minute. So this is the example of a mandate. So this was the supporting school, the policy heading. So that's the name. They just called it equality policy. Motion that the ISSU condemns the neglect of people with disabilities when it comes to fighting for a more inclusive school. And then mandates. This is more, this is a debate, so to speak. This is points to support it. What the part that is binding is this part here, the mandates. So this means that the membership of the ISSU mandates the NSE equality officer, as well as the president, to ensure that the union does not neglect the voice of people with disabilities who are in second level education. So that just gives you an idea of it's directing a very specific action to be taken. And we'll get into this deeper now, because these are more so the important ones. The most important thing is get the format right. And do not put something that belongs as a constitutional amendment as a directive mandate. It creates a lot of problems. So for example, you shouldn't mandate the executive to change the constitution, because then they can't change the constitution. They have to then propose it at the next annual assembly, and then they have to whether it gets passed or not is completely beyond their control. So that's something that's very important, so to speak. It should be a priority when you're putting forward a mandate. This is important in that we had a mandate and it was promoting the consumption of milk in Ireland, which is, yeah, great, really important. But is defending transgender rights more important? Is that something we need to make more priority of? And whatever you put forward, you need to bear in mind that it's something that's going to be the priority of the membership and the executive for the next year. When the president sits down and says, what am I going to do? They're going to look at the directive mandates that were passed, because that's what they've been told to do. And they're going to say, we're going to do this, 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 and this. Now, how we do the actual election of the mandates is that all of the directive mandates are put forward and everyone gets to choose 15. So you vote for 15 down a ballot. And then the top 15 that are elected by the membership are then put forward to the Quishtano and told, you need to get these done in the next year. And so, you know, if you propose one about promoting the consumption of milk and it's up against ones like defending transgender rights, well, we know which one's going to be more higher on the priority list for people. And so that's something that's very important to consider when you're putting forward a mandate. Do not say work on when you're making a mandate. This is very important do not mandate the Quishtano to lobby for change or work on getting this implemented. If you just say, just work on this, it means all they have to do is work on it. They don't have to actually achieve anything. And just work on work on climate change. Just that means you just put out a post saying stop climate change and you've completed that mandate. Whereas if you get more specific, for example, mandate them to achieve a doubling of guidance counsellor hours. That means that they only achieve the mandate when they've got something done, not when they're lobbying to do it, but when they've actually got something. And if they haven't got it, well, it means we haven't done our job. And that's really important to consider. You need them to know that working on something or sending one letter is not completing the goal. Achieving the change is the goal. Be specific on the actual outcome you want to see. So, for example, we want to mandate the Quishtano to achieve the implementation of gender-neutral bathrooms across schools. It's much better to actually have what outcome you want, how to go about achieving it, because you want to give officers the flexibility and ownership to run the campaign the best way, to focus on the actual outcome rather than following a strict method that has been fit into just a paragraph. So rather than saying publish a report on gender neutral bathrooms, say achieve the implementation of gender neutral bathrooms, and then the officer might say, okay, we'll publish a report. Or we could also do it this way. We could do a letter writing campaign. It gives that space. The most important thing is don't mandate specific officers. And when you're writing a mandate, you should not say, I mandate the equality officer to do this or to change that, because you might assign it to the wrong officer, which has happened in the past. And that officer might be inactive that year, which is a real challenge sometimes because it's their responsibility and it might not get done as such. The other point is that it's a job for the whole executive. When we have 15 amendments and therefore the entire Quishtano, if it doesn't happen, it's all of our faults. And it's because we have collectively failed to enact this change. And what that means is we can blame no one else. Whereas if it's just one person's job, well, if that one person is active, well, sure, it was Jimmy's job and they fell through. It's not my fault. No, we need that collective accountability, so to speak. And be strategic and use SMART goals. So as we know, the old SMART, so specific, make sure it's actionable and specific. Promoting LGBT rights is not as strong as ensuring primary school curriculum teaches children about LGBT relationships from the first RSE class. Having these specific outcomes will make, you'll see it being enacted. Whereas if it's this broad, it's very hard to see action come of it. Measurable, ensure that there's a clear idea when something's been accomplished. So working on non-binary rights is never finished. Like working on non-binary rights, there's no we've achieved working on non-binary rights, so to speak. But the adoption of gender neutral bathrooms across all new schools, we know whether or not we've achieved this or not. And the former is far more likely to result in little action, whereas this one here, you know, that's really specific and we know if we're doing that or not. Achievable, and don't be afraid to be ambitious is the other thing. Like really large swathes things are important, and that do we have that ambition. And if we're too specific and too niche, well, students aren't going to feel represented. So like the ICU, we can't pay for new bathrooms all across Ireland, but we can fight for the government to release that money, to release 10 million to be invested in toilet repairs across Ireland. So this is one kind of example. Realistic, I hate this word. Let's be realistic. No, don't be held back by other people's realism. Dream big in what you actually plan to do and what you want to achieve, and we'll get far further in trying to achieve it than if we were just being conservative. We can't cure student poverty in 12 months, but we can give it a good try. And what we will achieve in that time is far more than if we hadn't tried anything at all. The last one in SMART, just because it's there, is timed, but the mandates expire after 12 months anyway. So this is built in, so to speak. Here's an example of a mandate. So here's an example of a title: Freedom of Religious Dress for Students. When people have read this, when they look back and see the name of it, they're going to know exactly what it's referring to. The ISSU Cuiste so sorry, that's meant to be a G. So it's specific in, it's the Cuiste that needs to do this. Will work with managing bodies and the Department of Education to achieve concrete protections for all students to have the freedom to wear their religious attire in school, free from discrimination. This is specifically important for Muslim women who wear hijabs, as many students in Ireland are denied their civil liberties by not being allowed to wear these in schools. That is an example of a directive mandate that can be put forward. The three parts of this is: one, it tells you exactly who needs to do it, the Cuiste in collective, but not specifically referencing an officer. Working with managing bodies in the Department of Education. That's sort of getting in that it's not going into method, but saying, you know, we don't want the ISSU going to individual schools because there's 700 and it's going to take forever. We want to change at the national level where these students are protected from the top down. And then here's the key one: achieve concrete protections. We could have said here, the ISSU will work to ensure all students have the freedom to wear their religious attire. That could just be an awareness campaign, but here we've asked the Cuiste to be very clear in achieving concrete protections for these students. This needs to be set in stone and they need to have these protections in hand. And that means that we're going to know whether or not we have achieved this or not. The freedom to wear their religious attire in school. That's what our actual aim is. The outcome, when all the work is done, when everything has been put to bed and all the work has been done, the change that is going to be different before we started this work is that students will have that freedom. This point there is then getting more specific and highlighting a specific group that is at risk and has been subjected to this more than others in the Irish education system. And so that's just an extra piece of going into the specifics to give a little more focus for the Cuiste representative. Where I'm going to just hark back to this is that this, while meaning well, is not a great directive mandate, because the NSE Equality Officer will ensure the union does not neglect the voice of people with disabilities who are in second level education. And this is not measurable. There's no idea if we've achieved this or not. It's rather loose. Whereas if it said something like the ISSU mandates the Cuiste to fight to ensure that there is far more supports in school for disabled students, or change that to that we will double the number of SNAs that are available to students. And these are all different options. Or we will lobby for laptops to be available for all neurodiverse students. These are the kinds of things where if that had been put in there, you'd be able to tell us and you'd be able to hold us to account. You've not done anything here. Whereas, you know, with just this, if you can say you've not done anything, we can say, oh, well, we had a conference and we made a speech where we referenced this, and that would be filling it. And so it's really important that you hold us to account and ensure that we are doing our job. That is the directive mandates part over. And if I'll see that there's a couple of questions coming in, I'll just take a look here. Breakout rooms later. Is there any new questions in, Owen?
No, we'll just give people a chance if you want to put up your hand and ask one, or just throw it into the chat.
Also, I will say, I know how nerve-wracking it is being at the other end of a Zoom call. I know I am rushing a great deal, but we're all students here. I'm only 19. The rest of you are probably only 1 or 2 years younger than me. So please do feel free to ask any questions.
And again, you'll get a much more or less formal chance in the breakout rooms where we can just sit down and chat.
I think they find me intimidating, Owen. We'll have to give them a few more minutes.
No, don't be intimidated by Ruben.
Yeah, trust me. Okay, then we're just going on to the final one, and that is policy motions. Now, there's often a bit of confusion between directive mandates and policy motions. A directive mandate is saying a very specific job that has to be done. Policy motions are different. Policy motions are just the opinion, a position of the ISSU, a position of us as an organization, of the membership. So a directive policy is an official stance of the ISSU membership that will dictate ISSU policy decisions in the future. Our policy books, for example, if our policy book says we support giving 16-year-olds the vote, this means that the ISSU cannot oppose the introduction of vote at 16. So if we have someone who's elected president that says, I don't think 16-year-olds should have the vote, and we're going to go against this. Well, no, sorry. the policy book says very specifically, we are in favor of it. So this is the policy we need to take. These policies will dictate our public positions, but also if there are any submissions. So for example, we were asked to give a submission on bullying. Or if we have any meetings with stakeholders that is in any way relevant to any of the topics that are covered in our policy book, we will look at our policy book and we'll say, okay, these are the points we need to raise and we need to stay within the realms of what has been said here. The confusion often comes from the fact that our directive mandates and policy book is just this, it's in the same book. They have been separated now. I'll see an example, see if I can find an example here. Mandates recognizes.
Ruben, just have a question from Leo. How is the Christian held to account if a mandate is not completed?
Well, the problem is that a lot of the mandates aren't specific, so there's no real way to. The MAC is responsible for that. It's the monitoring committee, and it's through our reports that those are held to account.
Yeah, MAC will do a yearly report on work of the Christian, and they'll also do, and they'll be monitoring them frequently and keeping updated. This is the first time where we've like strictly have defined and separated policies and mandates, so that'll be a work in progress, but that will be down to the MAC. Now, again, policy, it's a lot easier to see that they're clearly going against that, and the amendments that are moving forward are giving the MAC the power to call the Christian out on it. But currently, it hasn't been very separated. So far, it's just been as you go. But we're defining that a lot better this year.
And what I would say is, if you feel that you aren't able to hold us to account more, well, that's a constitutional amendment for you to put in. Maybe we should put in a constitutional amendment. Any member school will be able to send an email to the Christian secretary asking for a detail of on a specific constitution, on a specific directive mandate, if it has been completed or not, and what work has been done to date, and for that to be shared with the monitoring committee. So that's an option as well, absolutely. This is an example of a directive policy. So it says proposing school. The ICU recognizes the dangers that students are subject to online and lack of awareness around appropriate online behavior and available supports. The ICU believes that all students should, as per the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, not be subject to any harms or threats, including online abuse and bullying. The NSE should support relevant organizations such as Webwise to stop online abuse and promote their initiatives to encourage online safety. The important part here is, as you can see there, that was not a specific action, so to speak. It was in that it said that there has to be a clear, how do you say, policy taken, but it wasn't in that there was any specific actions. And that's where it's an opinion of the membership. And that's really important. It's an opinion of the membership and where we believe, what we believe as an organization. The first point to consider when you're writing these policy motions is that they're long term. They're not around for 6 months. They're not around for a year. They're around for 3 years. There are still motions. They're only going out now that came in when I first entered this organization, and they were passed, and they're only phasing out now. And that's really important to consider. Getting the format right, and now this is something you really need to get your head around. Directive mandates are about the ISSU's opinion. It is not a place for specific actions or projects, but instead an expression of the beliefs and the opinions of the membership. For example, the ISSU believes that the CAO system is flawed and is in need of reform, not the Christian should work to implement CAO reform. Do you see the difference? Do not refer to specific officers in policy motions. Again, this is something that we brought up before and we will be bringing up it again. All officers of the union are bound by policy motions passed at the Bhliaintiúl. So you should refrain from motions referring to specific officers, because officer positions change and some positions get thrown out, new ones get created, and remits change from year to year as well. So that's really important. So you should refrain from specific officers. Now, the confusion between policy and mandates, sometimes you need both, and that's something to consider. They are different. So you can and sometimes should propose a mandate as well as a policy. Don't try to combine them, because that will be a problem. So you could propose a policy that lays out ISSU's position on the separation of religious ethos and sexual education. So, for example, you could put forward a policy saying the ISSU believes that sexual health education should not be influenced by religious ethos of schools and advocates for non-secular religious relationship and sexual education in schools. That's a policy. That is an opinion that will be around, and as many of these can be passed as possible. And that's just very clear, you know, this is what the values we hold as an organization. You can then put forward a directive mandate to make it a priority in the action plan for the next year, where you can say a specific action you want the Cuistighnó to take. For example, I think I actually have an example made up. It's not here, but you know, we the Annual Assembly mandates the Cuistighnó to agree a strategy with the Department of Education to create non-secular RSE in schools. So we get the minister to really say they are going to do this, and when, how, and at what point it's going to actually be done. And so that's where you can see you can do both. Sometimes you should do both, and sometimes you should just do one or the other. But the most important thing is not to try to kill two birds with one stone. This is our directive mandates book, as you can see here. It's currently the directive policy book, so you will have directive mandates and directive policy. They are separate, and they shall be two separate books at this annual assembly. But you can look at them here. And as we can say, it's all explained here at the actual YouTube video made by our wonderful communications officer, Quentin. The final point I will say on that is the directive mandates. They are, so what we do is you all vote on the ballot, and the top 15 that are voted get in. With just policy motions, we just vote on every single one collectively. And what happens then is if we are in favor by 50% plus one, they pass. And as many pass and whatever many pass, they all get put into the policy book. However many fail, and they just go. And so that's how that works. And so you're more likely to get something into a policy book than a directive mandate. The next point is just general information, and the most important thing is clarity. A clear title for your motion or amendment is essential. The main thing here is you don't, like, people are going to read it, and if you say have a weird title at the top, like as we saw back there, I'll go back so you can get the idea. Equality policy. That equality policy, what is that? They're going to have no idea when looking back. So a very clear title that you should put in that, something like, how do we see here? Equality for students with disabilities policy. That is an example that is far stronger, so to speak. That people are going to know exactly what it is when they're looking back, so they don't need to reread it to have an idea of what it is. And next, duplicates. So as I mentioned earlier, and I'll just do a quick recap at the end. Once all the amendments are in, they all get sent around and everyone can see them, and you still have a week to propose changes to those amendments. And if you see someone has made a very similar amendment or a very similar motion or policy, well, it doesn't really make sense for us to be debating two. So organize a call with that person. We can link you up and sit down and say, look, you know, let's see if we can combine these into one and make a better amendment. And we'll just change the amendment so it's the new one and then delete the other one. And it's far better. And that's something really to consider. Don't mention specific officers. You don't have to take this advice, obviously, but you'll have a far better executive and a far better union if you don't mention specific officers. Positive. This is more of a political point. When you put forward a motion or a constitutional amendment and it's very angry at other people in the union, or a constitutional amendment, and your rationale or your actual debate is filled with anger, it's very, very hard to get people to support it. And voters get put off by that, and the delegates don't tend to vote that way. So focusing on positive language and in a positive manner moving forward, you're far more likely to you're far more likely to get the actual votes you need to get it across the line. I think someone has their mic unmuted there. Okay. No campaigning. This is a point Owen raised. Proposing motions and amendment is not a space for campaigning by candidates and should not be hijacked as such. When I ran for president, I didn't put forward any directive mandates. I spoke on one or two, but I didn't put any forward. I actually wrote several, but I gave them to other people to put forward because I didn't want to be using it as a space to get that sort of visibility to the electorate. And that's really important. The same with debating. If you're a candidate, you know, give other people the chance to go up and speak on motions, because this is the opportunity for them to participate. Don't be using it as a platform from which to put out your candidacy. And also, if you mention your candidacy in any of your motions or debates, like that will not, that is a rule that's not allowed. And so just don't be doing that. The final thing is work hard. When writing your amendment, do research, reach out and ask questions. I'm known for loving a good policy dissection. But it's important that your policy is well thought out, specific and strategic, so it will achieve what it sets out to do. Otherwise, it's going to just fall flat on its face. And that's what tonight is for as well. You can sit down in a room with me, Owen or Jack, and ask, I don't know how to do it, but I want the ISSU to do a great deal more to help students with intellectual disabilities or students who are suffering below the poverty line. And I want to put forward a motion that's going to change that. And we can give you advice, we can give you strategies, or if you have something already written out, we can say, okay, these are the amendments you want to make to the Constitution, and I would change that word because otherwise it'll change that and you don't want to doing that. But that's what tonight is about, and that we want to give you that space. And that is the presentation. That's everything. And the point I would make is that, you know, that is what it is what it is. This is what our actual policies are. This is what makes up our union, and these